The fluorescent lights of Meridian Heights flickered twice. Then the emergency alarm split the morning silence. It was 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in February. The kind of morning when the city was still half asleep and nobody expected anything to go wrong. The kind of morning when systems worked the way they were supposed to. When buildings stood tall and confident, their engineering invisible because it was so perfectly functional. On the 45th floor, screens went dark. Elevators froze between levels. The central HVAC system began pumping air at dangerous pressure rates. Within minutes, the building's nervous system had descended into controlled chaos. Meridian Heights was a 45-story downtown tower. It dominated the skyline with the kind of presence that only money and engineering could create. It housed 12 major corporate tenants. Law firms where partners billed at rates most people never saw in a year. Financial services companies that moved billions of dollars with a keystroke. Consulting agencies that shaped corporate decisions across the country. The kind of businesses where people made more money in an hour than most Americans made in a week. The building was worth $800 million. It was insured for even more. Every system carefully engineered, every redundancy calculated, every contingency planned for, and it was failing. This was the kind of crisis that ended careers, reputations, entire trajectories of professional life. The kind of failure that followed a person forever, that became their defining moment. Victoria Ashford arrived at the operations hub 17 minutes after the first alarm sounded. Her black car pulled up to the building with the kind of efficiency that suggested she'd been waiting in traffic, engine idling, ready to move the moment the call came through. Her heels struck the polished concrete with the rhythm of someone who expected doors to open before she reached them. The kind of rhythm that only developed from years of walking into rooms where everyone immediately paid attention. At 42, she had already climbed higher than most executives twice her age. She had graduated summa cum laude from Wharton at 21, spent 4 years at McKinsey, learning to see organizations as systems of optimizable components, built a career on intelligence, relentless work ethic, and an absolute refusal to ever show uncertainty, and she wore her authority like a second skin, the kind that couldn't be removed without drawing blood. Her wardrobe was carefully curated, dark colors that didn't show stress or sweat, tailored cuts that conveyed power without requiring explanation, jewelry minimal but expensive. The kind of presentation that said, "I have already succeeded. Everything you see is evidence of my competence." Her eyes swept across the operations hub in a single fluid motion, cataloging faces, assessing competence, dismissing anything that fell outside her immediate chain of command. Her gaze was clinical. It assessed the room the way a chess player assessed a board, pieces to move, assets to deploy, liabilities to minimize. A black man in gray coveralls stood near the east corridor, a mop bucket beside him, his attention fixed on something beyond the glass partition. His dark brown skin and tight curls, flattened slightly where his maintenance cap rested, marked him as someone far outside the world of tailored suits and polished resumes. He was unremarkable in every way that mattered to Victoria's calculus of usefulness. She had learned long ago how to sort people into categories, useful or not, valuable or disposable. People who mattered and people who were just part of the background scenery, the infrastructure that kept things running but didn't require her attention or respect. One of her junior analysts, a young man named David Chen, with a Vanderbilt engineering degree, glanced in the janitor's direction, perhaps considering whether to consult him about the ventilation patterns. Perhaps wondering if that quiet man in grey understood something the crisis demanded they know. Perhaps recognizing in some instinctive way that intelligence wasn't always correlated with credentials. Victoria watched this moment unfold. She saw David's attention shift. She understood in some part of herself that she didn't examine too closely what he was considering. And something in her decided to close a door before it could open. Something in her insisted on maintaining the hierarchy, on keeping things in their proper categories, on preventing a moment of mutual recognition that might complicate her understanding of the world. Victoria's voice cut through the noise like glass breaking. "He's just a janitor." The words landed like a door slamming shut. Not cruel, not unkind, not even particularly harsh, just a statement of fact delivered with surgical precision. The kind of statement that doesn't need to be loud to be devastating. The kind of words that don't require anger to cause pain. Just simple categorical exclusion. Just the act of deciding in front of everyone that this person didn't belong in this conversation. The man in grey turned slightly, not toward Victoria, toward the hallway where a small girl sat in a plastic chair, her oversized backpack sliding off one shoulder. The girl was watching everything. Her name was Amara Wells. She was 8 years old, bright, observant, far too good at reading the faces of the adults around her. She had learned early, in the way children learn such things, that adult behavior often contradicted adult words, that what people said they valued and what they actually valued were often two different things, that power operated through small moments of dismissal just as much as through grand gestures. And in that single glance, the way the man looked at his daughter, Victoria saw something she hadn't expected to see, something her framework of usefulness and credentials hadn't prepared her to understand. That child was his entire world. She had just told everyone in that room that her father was nobody important. She had just placed a barrier between a man and his knowledge. She had just created a hierarchy that suggested certain people's minds mattered more than others. Victoria Ashford had no idea how much that moment would cost her. Marcus Wells had worked the night shift at Meridian Heights for 3 years, 7 months and 12 days. He knew this number precisely because his daughter Amara had started kindergarten on his first day of work. He had driven her to school that morning. She had been terrified. Small among much larger children, afraid of getting lost, afraid of not understanding the rules, afraid of being alone, he had crouched down to her eye level in front of the school, held her small backpack while she put her arms through, told her that she was brave, that she was smart, that she could do hard things. Now she was finishing 2nd grade. Time moved differently when you measured it in school pickups and parent-teacher conferences instead of quarterly reports and performance metrics. The years added up not in accomplishments but in the small moments that held everything together. Every morning before dawn, Marcus was up before Amara's alarm. He started the coffee in the kitchen, packed her lunch with the food she liked, laid out her clothes for the day. He had learned that routine was the scaffolding that kept everything from falling apart. Change one thing, miss one morning ritual, forget one small habit, and the whole structure could crumble. A child needed to know that things would happen the way they happened, that her father would be there, that the world had predictable patterns, that some things could be trusted. His dark brown hands told the story of those 3 years, calluses layered over calluses, small scars from chemical burns that came with industrial cleaning solutions, a permanent roughness that no amount of moisturizer could soften, that no amount of scrubbing could erase, that became, in a way, part of who he was. The evidence of labor written on his body. He had learned to keep them in his pockets when meeting Amara's teachers. During parent-teacher conferences, he would sit in tiny chairs designed for children's bodies, his large frame folding awkwardly, his hands tucked away. He had noticed how their eyes would drift downward when he spoke, taking in his dark brown skin, the grey coveralls even though he wasn't wearing them. The invisible badge that said custodial, cataloging, categorizing, filing him away in the mental folder marked working class, probably limited education, unlikely to cause problems or provide solutions, the kind of man who was there to clean up after the important people, not the kind of man whose opinions mattered, not the kind of mind that should be consulted on important decisions, just the infrastructure, just the background, just the man who made things clean. As a black man working nights in a gleaming downtown tower, Marcus understood exactly how quickly people decided who he was. Before he spoke, before they knew anything about him, before they had any reason to believe anything other than what the coveralls suggested. He had learned that the world made its judgments quickly, and once those judgments were made, they were nearly impossible to change. The night shift suited him in ways he rarely examined too closely. During the day, Meridian Heights was a hive of activity, hundreds of people moving through its corridors, phones ringing constantly, meetings happening behind glass-walled offices, conversations full of consequence and importance. But after midnight, something shifted. The building breathed differently. Its mechanical systems hummed in frequencies that most people never noticed. The kind of subtle vibrations that only revealed themselves to someone patient enough to listen. The kind of knowledge that could only come from paying attention, from caring enough to understand something deeply. Marcus noticed everything. He noticed the slight vibration in the west stairwell that indicated the fire suppression system needed recalibration. He had documented this over months, noted when it started, predicted what would happen if it wasn't addressed. He noticed the temperature differential between floors 39 and 40 that suggested ductwork degradation. He had drawn diagrams of this, made notes about what was causing it, calculated what the impact would be. He noticed patterns in the way the elevator motors cycled, the rhythm of the backup generators, the subtle complaints of a building that spoke only to those patient enough to listen. It was like learning a language nobody else in the building bothered to understand, like becoming fluent in a language nobody else spoke, like possessing knowledge that existed in a space between the official systems and the unwritten reality. Amara had started accompanying him on weekend shifts after his mother's health declined. Childcare had become another impossible equation to solve. His mother had raised Amara's mother. He had hoped they would help, but they had their own problems, their own struggles, their own inability to take on another person's child. So Amara came with him to the building at night. She would sit in the break room with her homework, working through math problems and spelling lists while her father made his rounds. She had learned to be quiet during work hours, to keep her voice down, to understand that this was her father's job and she needed to be the kind of presence that didn't make his job harder. Or sometimes she would walk beside him as he moved through the building's corridors and mechanical rooms, asking questions that cut through the darkness like small flashlights. "Daddy, why do some people not say hi to us?" Marcus would pause his work and consider the question seriously, because that was what his daughter deserved. Not dismissal, but honesty. Not simplification, but truthfulness. "They're busy, sweetheart." But the lady in the red shoes said hi to the man with the briefcase. He was busy too. Amara had a gift for this, for pointing out the contradictions in the world that adults had learned to ignore, for seeing through the excuses that kept the world functioning, for asking the questions that made people uncomfortable because they revealed the truth underneath polite fictions. Marcus had learned to navigate these conversations the way he navigated the building's service corridors, knowing which turns led to dead ends, and which opened into larger spaces where a person could breathe. He never lied to Amara, but he had become skilled at editing reality into shapes an 8-year-old could hold without cutting herself, at finding ways to tell her the truth while still protecting her from the harshest parts of it, at helping her understand that the world wasn't fair without making her believe that fairness was impossible. Victoria Ashford existed in a different universe entirely, one separated from Marcus's world not just by money or position, but by something more fundamental. A difference in how they understood human worth. Victoria lived in a universe where value was measured in credentials and quarterly projections, where a person's entire significance could be calculated from their title and corner office square footage, where success was quantifiable and failure was absolute. She had graduated summa cum laude from Wharton at 21, McKinsey at 25, Hartwell Properties at 28, each step a triumph, each achievement another brick in the structure of her identity. Her father had been a businessman, her mother had been a businesswoman. She had grown up in a world where achievement was everything, where ambition was celebrated, where the only question that mattered was, how high can you go? And at 42, she had learned a single inflexible rule about survival in the world she inhabited. Never let anyone see the moment before you know the answer. Always appear confident. Always appear prepared. Always appear as though you have everything under control. Because the moment people saw you falter, the moment they glimpsed uncertainty, they would begin to doubt everything else about you. In her world, doubt was contagious. Doubt spread through organizations like a virus. One moment of weakness could unravel years of careful impression management. She had built her entire career on the premise that value could be measured. Credentials, efficiency, output. Numbers that didn't lie, didn't disappoint, didn't require understanding the human cost of decisions. That framework had served her perfectly. For 20 years, it had been the foundation of her success. She had made decisions that affected hundreds of lives. She had implemented restructurings that cost people their jobs. She had closed inefficient divisions. She had cut costs by eliminating positions. She had always been able to point to the numbers and say, this is what the data demanded. This is what logic required. This is what efficiency dictated. And the numbers never complained. The numbers never cried. The numbers never went home to children and tried to explain why their father no longer had a job. Until something happened that numbers couldn't fix. Something that appeared on the screens as error codes and pressure readings, but underneath was something else entirely. A fundamental failure of the systems she had trusted. A failure that suggested that maybe, just maybe, the world was more complicated than spreadsheets could capture. And she realized, with a coldness that bordered on panic, that she didn't know what to do with problems that lived outside her spreadsheets. The crisis at Meridian Heights was already becoming one of those problems. She could feel it in the way the consultant's eyes had begun to avoid hers, the way her certainty was fracturing, brick by brick, leaving her standing in a room full of expensive people who were beginning to notice that she was no longer certain. And certainty was the only thing she had ever had. Without it, she was just a woman in expensive clothes, just a woman who had built her entire identity on knowing what to do, just a woman who was beginning to suspect she didn't actually know anything at all. So when she saw the janitor watching the screens with that expression of someone who understood, someone who could see what she was beginning to suspect she couldn't, she didn't hesitate. She closed that door before anyone else could see the crack in it. He's just a janitor. Because if she acknowledged that a janitor might know something she didn't, what would that mean about everything else she believed? About her entire framework for understanding the world? About her position at the top of hierarchies she had built her identity around? She couldn't afford to think about any of that, so she didn't. She simply made a statement and moved on and told herself it was the right decision. The situation began deteriorating immediately after that moment. Victoria assembled 3 external consultants by noon, each one from prestigious firms, each one with impressive credentials on their business cards, each one charging $3,000 per hour, the kind of consultants that major corporations called when they had problems, the kind of people who had solved difficult technical challenges before, the kind of minds that had been shaped by expensive educations. Each one confident they could diagnose what was wrong and fix it before anyone noticed the problem existed. The consultants arrived with laptops and diagnostic equipment. They set up in the operations hub. They ran diagnostics. They produced reports. They made recommendations. All of them failed. The building's systems continued degrading throughout the day. By evening, additional floors had lost climate control. Tenants were calling, asking questions, demanding explanations. The fire suppression system showed false readings that threatened to trigger evacuation protocols at any moment, the kind of evacuation that would empty the building of $800 million worth of business activity, the kind of panic that would make the news, the kind of public failure that couldn't be recovered from with a good press release. Pressure cascades spread to secondary systems that no one had anticipated could be affected. The water treatment system began showing signs of stress. The backup power systems showed fluctuations. It was like watching dominoes fall in slow motion, each failure creating the conditions for the next failure, each problem creating 10 new problems, each cascade of errors making it harder to identify the original source. Victoria began to feel real panic for the first time in decades. The kind of panic that lives in your chest and makes it hard to breathe. The kind that doesn't care about your credentials or your track record. The kind that reduces everything to, what if I fail? Her certainty had fully fractured. She called more meetings, demanded more reports, implemented more protocols. None of it worked. None of it could work because everyone was treating symptoms instead of looking for the disease. They were putting bandages on a problem that required actual understanding. On the afternoon of day 2, during a brief lull when the operations team had scattered to make phone calls and get coffee, Marcus approached one of the junior technicians. His name was David Chen, Vanderbilt engineering degree, 3 months at Meridian Heights, 26 years old and confident that his education guaranteed him expertise. The kind of confidence that the world had been carefully teaching him to have. The kind of belief that came from being told repeatedly that people like him were smart, that his mind mattered, that his opinions had value. Marcus waited until Victoria's back was turned toward the far end of the console. Her attention focused on something else. Her voice was quiet, carefully calibrated to reach only David's ears. Not loud enough to draw attention, but clear enough to be understood. The kind of voice that came from years of practice at speaking while not being heard. The pressure readings on floor 34, they're cycling in a pattern. David looked up from his terminal, his eyes narrowing, not confused, but recognizing something unexpected in the way Marcus had spoken, in the precision of his language. They're responding to false sensor data, Marcus continued, cascading in a feedback loop. Might want to check the reference sensors against the backup calibration logs from last October. David's mouth opened, just slightly, because that wasn't janitor language. That was engineering language. That was correct engineering language. The kind of language that demonstrated not just knowledge but understanding. The kind of analysis that came from thinking deeply about a problem, from paying attention to the details that mattered, from listening to what the building was trying to say. For half a second, something passed between them, a recognition that David had a path out of this crisis, and it didn't come from any of the consultants in the room. It came from the man in grey coveralls who had been dismissed as irrelevant. "How do you—" David started. Victoria's voice cut from behind them, sharp, cold, precise. She hadn't turned. She'd been listening, waiting, ready to protect her world from any intrusion that might complicate it. "He's just a janitor. He doesn't understand the diagnostic systems." The statement hung in the air with a particular kind of weight, because everyone in that moment understood. He did understand. The operations team had stopped talking. The consultants had paused in their work. Everyone had heard those words, and everyone knew what they meant. David looked at Marcus, and Marcus's expression was perfectly neutral. The expression of a man who had practiced retreating into invisibility, who had spent years learning how to take a blow without showing that he'd felt it, who understood that survival sometimes meant not reacting. But his jaw was tighter than it had been a second ago. Victoria felt something cold move through her chest, and in that coldness was a thread of something she didn't want to examine too closely. The sudden certainty that she had just made a mistake that would cost more than she anticipated, that by silencing Marcus she had silenced something essential, something that might have been the answer to everything, something that might have prevented this crisis from spiraling even further. Marcus returned to his cart without another word, without looking back, without any gesture of defiance or resentment. Just a quiet retreat back into the role he'd been assigned, back into invisibility, back into the place where it was safe because nobody expected anything from him. David said nothing to anyone about what he had heard, because he understood something fundamental about hierarchies, about how they work, about how they protect themselves, about what happened when you acknowledged that the wrong person had the right answer. Acknowledging Marcus's knowledge would be acknowledging that Victoria was wrong. And in that building, no one challenged Victoria Ashford and remained comfortable. He had just started his career. He needed the job, he needed the reference, he needed to succeed in this world, so he said nothing. But the knowledge stayed with him, that there was a man in this building who understood things that the expensive consultants didn't, and nobody was listening to him, that there was a hierarchy of voices in this building, and some voices mattered more than others, regardless of what they actually knew. That sometimes the smartest person in the room was the person nobody was paying attention to. That evening, around 6:15 p.m., alone in the operations hub, Victoria watched Marcus work. She could see him on the 34th floor, through the glass partition that looked out over the mechanical room, the space where all the building's critical systems converged, where the nervous system of the entire structure was laid bare, the machinery that made everything else possible. He was performing routine maintenance on equipment that most people in the building didn't know existed. Work that nobody noticed. Work that would never appear on any report or contribute to anyone's understanding of how the building actually functioned. But it was the work that mattered. It was the work that kept everything running. He moved with absolute efficiency, not hurried, not slow, measured, each movement deliberate, each action precise. His dark brown hands moved across panels and valves with a fluency that belonged in engineering firms, in universities, in design centers where the smartest minds in the field worked, not in night shifts at a janitorial company, not in a grey uniform with a name tag. Victoria realized something in that moment, something that her framework of credentials and titles had no way to explain. He's not just cleaning, he's listening to the building, the way a musician listens to an instrument, the way a parent listens to a child's cry in the dark. He understood the building not theoretically, but intimately, not through study, but through presence, through attention, through the kind of deep understanding that only came from spending years in conversation with something. She sat down at her desk and opened his employee file with trembling hands. Her mouse felt heavy, her breathing felt controlled, as though she were holding it carefully. Hire date, 3 years ago. Performance reviews, consistently exceptional. Emergency contact, sister, Georgia, education, blank. But there was a note, handwritten by the hiring manager. The letters slightly irregular, as though written quickly but with care. A note that should have been entered into the system but instead had been left as a handwritten comment. Candidate demonstrates advanced understanding of systems. Requested position in facilities despite overqualification. Cited family priorities. Hired. Overqualification. Victoria read that word 3 times. Let it sink in. Understood what it meant, what it implied, what it said about the man she had dismissed, and she understood finally what she had done by dismissing him in front of everyone. She hadn't just insulted a janitor. She had silenced the only person in her building who could solve her problem. She had deliberately, with calculation, with precision, prevented knowledge from being shared. She had created a world where the right answer couldn't be heard because it was coming from the wrong mouth. She had forced him to stay silent out of fear. Out of a fear that she had deliberately cultivated with those 7 words. He's just a janitor. The weight of what those words had accomplished was becoming clear to her now. They had created a boundary, not just between Marcus and the consultants, but between Marcus and his own knowledge, between what he knew and what he was allowed to say, between the solution that existed in his 3-year-old notebook and the problem that was destroying her building. She had made it impossible for him to speak. And she had done it not because he lacked knowledge, but because she needed to feel right, because she needed to maintain her hierarchy, because she needed the world to work the way she had decided it worked. The next evening, around 6:15 p.m., Victoria found Amara sitting outside the mechanical room in a small plastic chair, her oversized backpack beside her, sagging under the weight of whatever 8-year-olds carried to school and then carried home again, a purple backpack with cartoon characters on it. The kind of backpack that a child chose because they liked how it looked, not because it was practical. Her focus entirely on a drawing she was making on a small pad. A girl, still in school clothes, still wearing the tiredness that came from a day of learning and trying to be good and hoping nobody noticed when she was confused about something. Waiting for her father to finish work so he could take her home. Waiting in the way children waited. Patiently. Completely. Without resentment. Victoria hesitated. Then something made her stop. Something she didn't fully understand. Something in her that recognized that this small girl might see something worth seeing. "What are you drawing?" she asked. Amara looked up, her dark brown eyes assessing the woman in the expensive suit with the directness of a child who hasn't yet learned to lie, who hasn't yet learned to soften her observations with politeness, who still believed that honesty was possible. "The building," Amara said, "the inside part, the machines." She turned the pad. The drawing was surprisingly sophisticated, not childish in the way most 8-year-old drawings were, not stick figures in simple shapes, but actual systems sketched carefully with a pencil, pressure regulators and electrical panels, ductwork and valve systems, systems sketched with real understanding, connections drawn between them with lines that showed how one thing affected another. Small labels and careful letters that indicated not just copying but comprehension, a child's understanding of how something worked. "That's detailed for..." Victoria paused. "What grade are you?" "3rd, Amara said, "but Daddy talks about the building when he picks me up. He explains how things work, how everything connects." There was no accusation in her voice, just fact, just the simple reporting of what was true in her world. Her father explained complex systems to her. That was what he did. That was who he was. "He knows about all the machines?" Victoria asked, hearing the edge in her own voice. "He knows everything about this building," Amara said. "He tells me stories about the machines at night. He says every building is alive. It talks to you if you listen." But the next thing she said was delivered with the quiet weight of a child who has spent time listening to adults, not realizing she understands everything. "You're the lady who said Daddy was just a janitor." Victoria felt the words land like a physical blow, like she'd been punched in the chest and the air had left her lungs. She tried to speak, nothing came out. She tried again, still nothing. "Amara, I didn't mean... You said it like being a janitor was a bad thing," the girl continued, returning to her drawing with the focus of someone who has said what needed to be said and was moving on to other matters. "Like it made him less smart, but he's the smartest person I know." She looked up again, and her eyes held something that Victoria had never experienced before. Judgment, not anger, not vindictiveness, just honest judgment delivered by an 8-year-old who had no framework yet for understanding why adults lied about things that were plainly true. who didn't yet know how to be polite about obvious falsehoods. "Are you why he's been quiet since this morning?" Victoria couldn't speak. The words wouldn't come. She had no explanation, no framework for explaining this to a child, no way to defend the choice she had made. "He gets quiet when people don't see him the right way," Amara said. "But he doesn't say anything. He just gets quieter." She returned to her drawing. And Victoria understood, delivered by an 8-year-old with complete clarity. She had hurt not just Marcus. She had hurt this child's belief in her father's value in a world that was already teaching her that some people didn't matter, that some people's minds didn't count as much as their uniforms, that some people's knowledge was only valuable if they had the right credentials to carry it. That expertise had a color, and intelligence had a class, and worth was determined by where you worked, not by what you knew. She had taught Amara that there was another world, a world where her father was less than, a world where the things he knew didn't matter because of who he was. Victoria walked back to the operations hub without another word. Her legs felt unsteady, her breathing felt wrong, her certainty had moved beyond fracturing. It was crumbling, but she didn't stop thinking about those words, those simple, devastating words that an 8-year-old girl had delivered with the precision of a surgeon, with the clarity of someone who saw exactly what was true. "He's the smartest person I know." By midnight on day 3, the situation had deteriorated beyond all contingency plans, beyond anything that could be recovered with the right consultants or the right approach or the right amount of money and authority. Pressure irregularities had spread to the life safety systems. The building's fire suppression network was receiving contradictory signals, signals that could trigger either false activations that would panic tenants and damage systems unnecessarily, or dangerous failures to respond to actual emergencies, the kind of failures that could destroy lives, that could trap people in the building while systems that were supposed to protect them failed. The city fire marshal had been notified. He had given them until 8 a.m. the next morning. A mandatory evacuation was being discussed for the following morning if the situation could not be resolved, which meant going public, which meant admitting failure, which meant the end of Victoria's career at Meridian Properties, probably the end of her career in commercial real estate altogether. There would be investigations, lawsuits, regulatory reviews, her name attached to one of the largest infrastructure failures in the city's recent history, articles in professional journals questioning her judgment, her peers watching her fall, her competitors circling. Victoria hadn't slept in 36 hours. Her certainty had fully fractured. She was running on coffee and adrenaline and the cold fear that lived in her stomach like a stone. The consultant's latest report suggested controlled evacuation, suggested that they had tried everything, suggested that they had reached the limits of their capability, suggested that this was beyond what human expertise could repair. It suggested failure. It suggested that she had already lost. She stood alone in the operations hub at 11:47 p.m., the building around her humming with the sound of systems in distress, error messages flashing on screens, alarms that had been silenced but whose presence hung in the air like ghosts, willing herself to see something the data hadn't shown her yet, willing herself to find an answer that didn't involve admitting that she had been wrong, that she had silenced the person who might have prevented this, that she had prioritized her own certainty over the possibility of understanding. That's when Marcus entered quietly, carrying his mop and his evening maintenance supplies, not making a scene, not announcing himself, just appearing in the way he appeared every night. A presence that most people had learned not to see, a figure in grey who moved through the building like a ghost. Victoria immediately told him to stay away, to keep the crisis cordoned off from the night shift, to preserve some separation between the day people and the night people, between the important people and the invisible people. But Marcus didn't leave. Instead, he approached her. His voice was careful, shaped by years of understanding his place in other people's hierarchies, shaped by the practice of speaking in ways that wouldn't trigger defensiveness or dismissal. With respect, everyone's responsible. I know this building better than anyone, and I think I know what's wrong. Victoria felt a spike of hope pierce through the fog of her exhaustion, the kind of hope that was dangerous, the kind that required surrender, the kind that meant admitting she had been wrong all along. Then desperation, then anger at herself for hoping, for allowing this man into her crisis, for admitting that she needed him. I have 7 consultants who are solving for what they expect to find, Marcus finished quietly. Not for what's actually there. He waited, his hands still, his expression calm, giving her the choice. Listen or dismiss. Open the door or close it again. Admit she was wrong or protect her pride. Victoria thought about Amara's drawing, about David's moment of recognition, about hours of watching a man she'd silenced understand her building while she stood paralyzed, about the weight of what she had done by speaking 7 words, about the cost of her certainty. Show me, Victoria said finally. Marcus opened his messenger bag, the kind of bag a maintenance worker carried tools in, worn leather, scratches and stains from years of use. But from it he pulled a spiral notebook, filled with pages of meticulous handwriting, 3 years of documentation, 3 years of listening, 3 years of paying attention to things that nobody else in the building thought to notice, pages filled with observations and analysis, diagrams and equations. The kind of technical knowledge that should have come from a degree program, not a night shift maintenance schedule. I've been documenting the building for 3 years, he said. Every night shift I listen to it, I pay attention to the sounds it makes, the patterns in its behavior, and what I've found is... He opened to a page covered in careful diagrams and equations, the kind of technical knowledge that should have come from a degree program, not a night shift maintenance schedule. A feedback loop started 18 months ago, when the integrated management system was first installed. A single sensor was calibrated wrong, just 1 degree off, and the entire system has been compensating for bad data ever since. Victoria stared at the pages, at the precision, at the years of accumulated knowledge, at the evidence of a mind that had been listening to a building with a kind of attention that no consultant could match. The kind of attention that came from caring about something deeply, from understanding that systems were more than numbers, that buildings were alive, that they spoke to those willing to listen. Why didn't you say anything? She asked. Not angry anymore, just baffled, not understanding how she could have been so wrong. Marcus closed the notebook gently. The way someone closes something precious, the way someone holds something that matters. I tried. You told everyone I was just a janitor who didn't understand. There it was, the moment where she had to fully confront what she'd done. Not just an insult, but an act of silencing, an act of making it impossible for knowledge to flow from one person to another, an act of choosing her own certainty over the possibility of understanding. I'm sorry, Victoria whispered. The words felt inadequate, felt like they couldn't possibly repair what she had broken. Marcus didn't minimize it, didn't tell her it was okay, or that she was forgiven, or that it didn't matter. He just held her gaze and said the truth. I know. Help me fix it? And in that question, the grace of asking, not demanding, Victoria understood exactly what she had been too afraid to see. He was never the problem. She was. Her certainty was the problem. Her need to control, her refusal to listen, her determination to maintain a hierarchy that protected her identity. She had created this crisis not through incompetence, but through arrogance, through the refusal to see what was in front of her, through the silencing of the voice that might have helped. Marcus entered the control room at 11:47 p.m. on day 3. Victoria had cleared the space exactly as he'd asked. No consultants, no observers, no one watching or waiting or ready to judge. Only security at the doors, and the building itself, waiting to be understood. He did not speak, did not explain his process or his reasoning, did not make himself feel better by narrating what he was doing. Just began. For the first 90 minutes, Victoria watched from outside the glass. She watched his hands move across the console. She watched him navigate systems with the ease of someone who had spent years learning their language. She watched him work with a kind of focus that excluded everything else. His entire attention on the problem in front of him. His entire being directed toward understanding and fixing. But somewhere around minute 95, she realized she couldn't watch from a distance anymore. She entered the room and stood in the corner. Quiet, present, witnessing. Not helping because she didn't have the knowledge to help, but there, just there. A presence that acknowledged what she had done, that witnessed what was happening, that bore witness to the solution that was unfolding. Marcus worked without acknowledging her, but at one point, around hour 2, his hands paused on the console, just for 3 seconds, and she saw his shoulders drop, like he'd been carrying something for a very long time and finally set it down, like he'd been holding a weight that she couldn't see but could recognize in the way his body changed, like the burden of invisibility was suddenly, briefly, tangible. Then he continued. By hour 3, the pressure readings had begun to stabilize. One system, then another, each one returning to normal operation, each one confirming that he had understood the problem correctly, that his years of listening had taught him to see what others had missed. At 3:47 a.m., the final sequence completed. The entire building seemed to exhale. Error codes cleared from the screens. Red warnings transformed into green lights. The fire suppression system returned to reliable operation. The pressure regulators stabilized. The HVAC system began functioning normally. The building breathing again. The building alive again. Marcus stepped back from the console. For a long moment he didn't move. His dark brown hands were still, his eyes fixed on the stable readings in front of him. The building breathing normally, the way it should have been breathing all along. Victoria saw it then. Relief so profound it looked almost like grief. Because fixing it meant he had to go back to being invisible. Because revealing his competence meant the world would expect things from him he'd spent years learning not to expect from himself. Because invisible was safe, and competent was demanding, and he had chosen to be seen. And now he couldn't unsee what that cost. You did it, Victoria said quietly. Marcus turned, and their eyes met for the first time since this had all begun. Not as executive and janitor, not as people in a power structure with predetermined roles, but as two people who had just spent hours in a small glass room understanding something about each other that couldn't be unseen. How did you know it would work? Victoria asked. I didn't, Marcus said, but I understand this building, and I understood what the consultants didn't, that the problem wasn't the system. The problem was the system was responding logically to bad information. Just like... He paused. Just like what? Like people, he finished quietly. We respond logically to the information we're given. And if the information is wrong, we make the best decision we can with lies. Victoria understood he wasn't just talking about senses anymore. He was talking about her. About the lies she'd been told about who mattered. About what qualified someone to solve problems. About what kind of man could understand a building so deeply. About the lies she'd chosen to believe because they protected her identity. I'm sorry, she said. He held her gaze. I know. That's not enough, is it? No, Marcus said, but it's where we start. And something shifted in Victoria's chest. Not forgiveness exactly, something harder than that. The beginning of understanding that grace wasn't something she deserved, but something he was choosing to offer anyway, despite everything, despite her dismissal, despite her silence, despite her refusal to listen. The next morning, the lead consultant, Carol Weiss, arrived to review the solution. She came with her team, with spreadsheets and reports and analysis of what had gone wrong. She stood in front of the control room screens, studying the reports, trying to understand how the problem had been solved, trying to figure out what she had missed. The feedback loop, she said slowly. We should have caught this. The cascading sensor errors should have been visible in our diagnostics, Victoria responded coldly, her voice carrying the weight of what she'd learned. It was. Someone mentioned it. You dismissed him. Carol looked confused, defensive. The janitor, Victoria continued. He told you exactly what was wrong. You told him he didn't understand. Then you charged my company $47,000 to arrive at the same conclusion 3 days later. The janitor couldn't have... But he did, Victoria interrupted, because he listened. You came here expecting to find what you already believed you'd find. That's not problem solving. That's confirmation bias dressed up as expertise. She paused, her voice steady now, clear. I'm paying you for your work, but I'm not paying you again. Because I've learned something more valuable than your credentials. Expertise doesn't come from the titles you wear. It comes from the attention you pay. Victoria walked out of that meeting with her head held differently than before. Not proud, but honest. The kind of honesty that comes from being broken and choosing not to hide it. Marcus returned home to Amara after the solution was complete. She was waiting up even though it was nearly 5 a.m., waiting with questions about whether he'd done the thing, about whether the building was fixed, about whether the lady who had said mean things finally understood. Marcus confirmed he had fixed it. Amara asked, "Did you have to be scared?" Marcus responded, "For a minute." Amara said, "But you did it anyway." Statement of fact, not question. The kind of observation that only a child could make with such clarity, such directness, such understanding of what courage actually meant. Marcus affirmed. Amara said with complete satisfaction, "That's what you always tell me to do. Do the thing even when it's scary." Amara added, "So you were taking your own advice?" Marcus laughed and they finished the bedtime routine. He tucked her in, kissed her forehead, promised he would sleep soon. That night, alone, Marcus sat at his kitchen table, and he finally allowed himself to feel the weight of what he'd carried for 3 years. The fear, the restraint, the choice to stay invisible, the decision to prioritize his daughter's security over his own ambition. He thought about the engineering career he'd abandoned, the programs he could have applied to, the trajectory that might have been. He thought about all the nights he'd stood in the shadows of that building, understanding systems that nobody credited him with understanding, holding knowledge that nobody asked for. He thought about what it had cost him to be patient, to wait, to listen, to understand before speaking. He opened his laptop and submitted his application to the city's advanced engineering program, the one he'd abandoned years ago, the one he'd convinced himself didn't matter anymore, the one that required evening classes and sacrifice and the belief that his life could still change. This time, he didn't withdraw it. This time, he stayed. 3 months later, Marcus received his acceptance to the city's advanced engineering program. He had applied while still working the night shift, while still raising Amara, while still putting in the hours that most people would have found impossible. He began attending evening classes, coming home after his shift, sleeping a few hours, waking to study while Amara did her homework. Amara helped him study. They researched together. She asked him questions about physics and engineering, some of which he could answer, some of which forced him to think harder about what he thought he knew. She became his study partner, his collaborator, his witness to the rebuilding of his own life. Victoria watched from a distance, no longer trying to insert herself into his life, no longer trying to be the one who fixed things or solved problems. Instead, she became a different kind of leader, one who listened, who asked questions before dismissing, who understood that expertise wears many uniforms, that intelligence expresses itself in different languages, that knowledge sometimes comes from the places you least expect to find it. She implemented new protocols at Meridian Heights. She created channels for input from employees at every level, not just consultants and supervisors and people with degrees, but janitors, security guards, maintenance workers, the people who moved through the building and understood it in ways that nobody with a title ever could. She created monthly sessions where anyone could raise concerns regardless of their position, and the building responded. Systems improved, efficiency increased, problems were identified and fixed before they became crises. Meridian Heights became known in the industry, not for architecture, but for how it treated people. The building received industry awards for innovative community engagement. Trade publications ran articles about its unusual management approach. Other properties began copying the model. Marcus eventually became assistant building manager, then facilities director, then 5 years later, director of engineering for all Meridian Properties locations. But he never forgot the night shifts. He never pretended they didn't happen. He never stopped looking for talent in places others didn't see. On his first day as director, Marcus changed the hiring policy. He specifically recruited from overlooked communities, from positions nobody thought to look. He mentored young people of color who were told they didn't belong in STEM. He created pathways for people like him, people who had knowledge and intelligence but lacked the credentials that gatekeepers said they needed. He remembered what it felt like to be invisible, and he made sure that invisible people in his building weren't. Amara, now 13, attended his promotion ceremony. She was no longer the small girl who had sat in a plastic chair waiting for her father. She was tall now, still observant, still asking hard questions about how the world worked. She hugged him and whispered, "I always knew you were a real engineer." Victoria watched from the audience, and something in her face had softened, not weakness, but the particular strength that comes from being wrong and choosing to change. She understood finally what grace costs, not less, but more. More attention, more listening, more willingness to be changed by people you once dismissed. She learned this was the only strength that actually mattered, and somewhere in that learning she became the kind of leader who built better buildings. Not because the walls were stronger, not because the systems were more efficient, but because the people inside them finally felt like they belonged, like their knowledge mattered, like their presence was necessary, like there was no such thing as just anything, just a janitor, just a security guard, just a maintenance worker, just a black man trying to raise his daughter in a world that kept telling him he didn't matter. That was a lie, and Victoria Ashford had finally, painfully, beautifully learned to see the truth underneath it.